because I'm going to send it out. This hearing will come to order. When the Obama administration was strong-arming Senate Democrats to save its Iran's deal, many promises were made. Central to the White House storyline was the president's claim that sanctions on Iran for terrorism, sanctions on Iran for human rights and ballistic missiles will continue to be fully enforced. As many will recall, Treasury Secretary Liu said unequivocally that Iranian banks will not be able to clear U.S. dollars through New York, hold correspondent account relationships with U.S. financial institutions, or enter into financing agreements or arrangements with U.S. banks. He testified, and I quote, "Iran, in other words, will continue to be denied access to the world's largest financial and commercial market." But unfortunately, the administration's words have not matched its actions. The administration has meekly responded to Iran's provocative acts, thanks in part to the weak UN Security Council language it agreed to on ballistic missiles. And just one Iranian has been sanctioned for human rights abuses since negotiations began. Just one. Indeed, last month, a top Treasury official publicly proclaimed that non-nuclear sanctions would undermine the Iran agreement. That's the opposite of what the committee was told. If Iran objects, the administration bends over backwards to accommodate. Effectively, the supreme leader now holds the veto pen over future congressional action. Iran will keep pushing until the Obama administration stops rolling over. Congressional pressure may have knocked the administration off their plans for now to allow Iran access to the U.S. dollar, which is the world's top currency. But the administration refuses to rule out a future move. And in the meantime, it is actively working other angles to push new investment into the Iranian economy. Secretary Kerry is in Europe this week taking the odd step of reassuring open for business. Other administration officials go so far as to say that Iranian economic growth is in our national security interest. That's a tough case to make when you consider that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been labeled Iran's most powerful economic actor. And it was labeled so by the U.S. Treasury Department. That's the terrorist IRGC that they're talking about. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is Iran's most powerful economic actor, according to our Treasury Department. The reality, though, is that the administration pep talks to international companies to spur investment in Tehran will be viewed skeptically. For investment is like a rope. It can't be pushed into a country that is corrupt, that holds international businessmen hostage, that launches missiles marked "Israel must be wiped out." Rather, it is pulled into countries that are transparent, that respect contracts, and don't threaten their neighbors. Banks want maximum certainty, and that just won't be found in a country that ranks 130 of 168 on Transparency International's Corruption Index. And as we will hear today, a CEO's understanding of their company's reputational risk is more powerful than any sanction Congress could write. An international banker doesn't want to end up on the wrong side of a transaction, which unwittingly funnels money to Iran's ballistic missile program. And the designation of the entire territory of Iran as a primary money laundering concern, and that's the way we designate it, means just that any financial transaction with Iran risks supporting the regime's ongoing illicit activities. Many of the restrictions left on Iran are intended to protect our financial markets from such abuse. The international organization charged with countering money laundering worldwide declared this year that it is, quote, exceptionally concerned about Iran's failure to address the risk of terrorist financing and the serious threat this poses to the integrity of the international financial system, unquote. That is why my legislation to prohibit the administration from allowing the U.S. dollar to be used to facilitate trade transactions with Iran and which upholds Iran's designation as a primary money laundering concern is so key. Iran is still the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Until it stops funding terror, until it stops the illicit weapons program, it should be treated like the global menace it is. I now turn to the ranking member for any opening comments he may have on our hearing today.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing, and to our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. We value your time and your expertise, especially as the implications of the Iran deal began to fold. I was chuckling this morning that it occurs to me there's a lot of Iran expertise on Capitol Hill today. We have a presidential candidate up here meeting with the Speaker who told AIPAC about the Iran deal. I've studied this issue in great detail. I would say actually greater by far than anybody else, so perhaps he should be one of our witnesses. But I'd rather have all of you, the three of you today, instead. When the details of the agreement were released last year, it appeared that when sanctions were lifted, the Iranians would receive a windfall to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. Last month, Secretary Kerry said that Iran has only come into about $3 billion as a result of sanctions relief. Now, I'm not losing sleep because Iran can't get its hands on huge sums of money, but it is worth asking, now that the deal is going forward, why is Iran seeing just a trickle instead of a surge? The explanation, as I understand it, couldn't be less of a surprise. Banks don't want to do business with Iran. They understand the risks. They see the same patterns of dangerous behavior that the rest of the world has seen for years: an illegal ballistic missile program, support for terrorist groups, human rights abuses, corruption and money laundering. So it's no wonder that the Financial Action Task Force, what we call FATF, continues to designate Iran as a high-risk jurisdiction. Just like Iran's leaders, Iran's financial institutions don't play by the same rules as the rest of the world. As a result, international businesses and financial firms want nothing to do with Iran. So what does this mean for the deal? I certainly don't think we should be making any concessions to Iran beyond the scope of what's in the deal. What's in the deal. As you know, I voted against the deal. In my view, it's reasonable for the United States to clarify what's against our law and what's not, what kind of business transactions are now in bounds, and what kind of activity might run afoul of other laws and sanctions. But we've lived up to our end of the bargain. I didn't like the deal, but I have no doubt that we'll keep our word. At the end of the day, if Iran's leaders are unhappy with the reluctance of the global business community to play ball, they have no one to blame but themselves. If Iran wants to shed its pariah status, it needs to abandon the activities that led us to isolation in the first place. Stop supporting terrorism. Stop suppressing the human rights of the Iranian people. Stop building ballistic missiles. Incidentally, that's where our focus should be as well, continuing to hold Iran's feet to the fire in all of these areas. And I know the Chairman and I have had many discussions, and we will hold Iran's feet to the fire. Secretary Kerry told this committee last summer, we will not violate the JCPOA if we use our authorities to impose sanctions on Iran for terrorism, human rights, missiles, or any other non-nuclear reason. And the JCPOA does not provide Iran any relief from U.S. sanctions under any of those authorities or other authorities. That's a quote from Secretary Kerry. So when we see ballistic missiles with the words "Israel must be wiped out" etched on the side in Hebrew from the Iranians, when tens of millions of dollars go to Hamas to rebuild its network of terror tunnels, when thousands of rockets end up in Hezbollah's hands, when Iran continues to prop up the Assad regime, Shia militias in Iraq and Houthi fighters in Yemen, when we intercept ship after ship carrying carrying Iranian weapons, we need to consider whether we're putting those existing authorities to their best use. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about what more we can be doing to compel Iran to change course away from all these harmful and destabilizing actions. I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We have a distinguished panel before us this morning. Mr. Mark Dubowitz is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he leads projects on Iran, on sanctions, and nonproliferation. He is the author of 15 studies examining economic sanctions, and we welcome him back to the committee here this morning. Mr. Juan Zarate is the Chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network. Previously, Mr. Zarate served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. From Orange County, California, Mr. Zarate was also the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. Welcome again. Ms. Elizabeth Rosenberg is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, and previously, Ms. Rosenberg served as a Senior Advisor at the Treasury Department. So without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or any extraneous material for the record. But what we would encourage is for our witnesses to summarize their remarks. We'll start with former Assistant Secretary Zarate, and then go to Mr. Dubowitz, and then Ms. Rosenberg.
Chairman Royce, thank you very much for the invitation to be here and the honor to testify before this distinguished committee. Ranking Member Engel, thank you very much as well. I'm honored to be on this panel with 2 great colleagues and friends, and so we're gonna have a jovial panel today. I respect Mark and Liz very much, so thank you very much. I also want to say, Mr. Chairman, my father and brother are here visiting from Orange County, California, so I'm very proud that they're here to see you and to witness this, so thank you very much. And a final preambulatory statement here. I want to thank you for your leadership and the leadership of this committee, former leadership as well, Congressman Ross Layton, for issues that don't often receive a lot of attention in the press. Issues like Iran obviously do, but ending conflicts in Africa, worrying about proliferation networks, worrying about arms trafficking networks like those run by Victor Bout, are all things that you have worried about for years, and we've worked on together. And I want to thank you for that commitment and the work of this committee. It's been serious and important.
Thank you for your work in helping put Victor Bout behind bars.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Well, let me now summarize some of the points of my testimony. As this committee may be aware, when the JCPOA was being debated and when I testified before the Senate, I expressed deep concerns and reservations about the structure, demands, and effects of the nuclear deal on U.S. interests, especially in anticipation and the likelihood of increased belligerence and adventurism from Iran. And as we know and we've witnessed, this belligerence has continued and been amplified. Iran has conducted repeated ballistic missile tests in violation of UN sanctions and promises further launches. Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general head of the Quds Force, traveled twice to Moscow, at least, in contravention of international travel bans to coordinate military cooperation with the Russian government. Iran remains the leading state sponsor of terror and has continued its direct support to terrorist proxies throughout the world, from Hezbollah to Iraqi Shiite militias to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Iran has deployed shock troops to Syria to fight for, die, and defend the Assad regime, with reports of thousands on the ground. Iran has continued to engage in human rights abuses internally. It continues to detain 2 Iranian-American citizens, and Robert Levinson, missing from Kish Island since March of 2007, remains missing and unaccounted for. And on January 12th, 2016, we witnessed the Iranian naval forces arresting 10 American sailors at gunpoint and broadcasting the video of their detention in order to humiliate them in the U.S. Navy. Unfortunately, these actions are not surprising, and they will continue. But more importantly, the nature of the regime, its control of the economy, its willingness to use the financial system to pursue all its goals internally and externally has not changed either. The Iranian system is corrupt, lacks transparency at all levels, and is centrally controlled by the regime. This, along with the uncertainty of how the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, will unfold, creates enormous risk for legitimate international actors and companies considering doing business in or with Iran. This, in part, explains why there hasn't been a wave of legitimate Western businesses investing aggressively or operating directly in Iran. The risks are real, and they're significant, and they're under consideration, especially when the IRGC remains in control of vast swaths of the Iranian economy, when the banks have been misused to finance terror and support the regime's causes, when the clerical regime controls bonyads worth billions of dollars, raising issues of kleptocracy and corruption. And there's no sign that the Iranians will stop using the financial system for illicit purposes. In fact, the U.S. government and international bodies like the FATF have declared the Iranian system, the central bank, as primary money laundering concerns and reason to have a high risk and posture toward their activities. So this complicated risk environment has dissuaded most legitimate companies from doing business. There's the risk of existing sanctions, secondary sanctions, remaining EU and UN sanctions, the potential for enforcement, not just by the U.S. Treasury, but by other authorities. Also, the fundamental fact that there are financial risks that in 2016 are important for financial institutions and businesses to take into consideration. We're no longer simply worried about sanctions risk in Iran. We're worried about other illicit financing risks. And certainly it appears that Iran has made it its business and its strategy to force the United States and Europe to help rehabilitate itself in the international system. This is something that we predicted, something I testified to, something we anticipated they would do, and they have. But the U.S. shouldn't fall into this trap. We shouldn't be in a position of rehabilitating Iran. We shouldn't be sending delegations around the world to explain how it is that we can do business in Iran legitimately. We should not be undercutting our authority by telling European businesses that they need not listen to the regulatory policy or other actions of U.S. Treasury or regulatory officials. Quite the opposite. We should be reinforcing the effect and reach and suasion of our authorities around the world. And certainly we shouldn't be giving Iran the accommodation and the ability to use dollars in offshore clearing accounts, facilities that would give them something that certainly was not negotiated in the deal, but would also give them the benefit of international trade and access to dollars. Certainly not when this remains the leading state sponsor of terror and under Section 311 of the Patriot Act, a primary money laundering concern. Mr. Chairman, I also think we shouldn't diminish our ability to use targeted unwinding as this negotiation unfolds to benefit our strategic interests. For example, with respect to the Iranian banks, as opposed to simply plugging them back into the global system, we should have a system of strictly monitoring what's happening in those banks so that we have a monitored re-entry into the financial system, allowing us both to monitor what's happening in those banks, but also giving reassurance to the financial system that we understand what's happening in and through those institutions. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I think the current state of affairs reveals that there were some faulty assumptions about where we were with the deal. The fact that our power was waning in terms of the ability to use financial suasion and tools of exclusion. That's not right. The fact that the deal would bring diplomatic unity, a reward for good behavior, that is not happening. The fact that the JCPOA would open channels for discussions with Iran about these other activities, that is not happening. In short, Mr. Chairman, the aversion to the risks of doing business in and with Iran will continue, especially if Iran demonstrates an unwillingness to stop its provocative and dangerous activities. Iran will not be in a position to join the international community completely if it does not demonstrate clearly that it can engage as a trusted and transparent actor in the financial system. The onus to prove this should be on Iran's shoulders. Any complaints about access to capital, markets, or investment should be posed to the clerical regime. Iran has to decide whether it will abide by international standards, norms, and obligations, and we shouldn't give them a free pass. Absent this, it will remain risky business to do business in or with Iran. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Zarate. Doctor?
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, on behalf of FDD and its Center on Sanctions Illicit Finance, thank you very much for inviting me to testify today, and it really is a great honor to be testifying with Juan and with Liz, whose work and whose service to our country I greatly admire. The nuclear deal with Iran provided Iran with a patient pathway to nuclear weapons capability by placing limited, temporary, and reversible constraints on its nuclear activities. The deal and the interim agreement that preceded it provided Iran with substantial economic relief to avoid an economic crisis and return to a modest recovery path. Iran's return to oil markets and the lifting of restrictions on Iran's use of some $100 billion in frozen overseas assets gave the regime badly needed hard currency to settle its outstanding debts, begin to repair its economy, rebuild its foreign exchange reserves, and ease a budgetary crisis, which in turn freed up funds for the financing of terrorism and missiles. Iran already has gotten significant economic relief. It avoided an economic collapse. And Ranking Member Engel, I hope we have an opportunity to talk about your comment on the $3 billion that Secretary Kerry made, which, interestingly enough, Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post yesterday gave that claim 2 Pinocchios, so we should discuss why. Now, the nuclear deal did nothing to address Iran's missile development, support for terrorism, regional destabilization, human rights abuses, and all of these things have remained just as problematic, or in some cases have actually gotten worse since the JCPOA was reached. During last summer's congressional review period, the administration pledged that the U.S. would continue to enforce these non-nuclear sanctions and oppose Iran's dangerous activities. And Iran has threatened that if these non-nuclear sanctions are imposed, it would walk away from the agreement and snap back its nuclear program, something that I've called the nuclear snapback in prior testimony. Congress should reject this nuclear blackmail. It needs to hold the administration accountable for the commitments that they made to you. Sanctions against Iran's many malign activities are clearly not a violation of the JCPOA, as Iran claims, but it's an affirmation of U.S. policy, actually as Secretary Kerry himself has articulated when he said, quote, "We will do everything to oppose Iran's destabilizing policies with every national security tool available." But it sure doesn't appear that the administration is going to stand behind its own policy. Since the nuclear deal was reached, only 9 individuals and 9 entities have been added to Treasury's sanctions list for all of Iran's ongoing illicit activities, including missile tests. And the administration has backed away, using the term, quote, violations, instead of arguing that these tests are now inconsistent with the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Nor are we likely to see action against human rights abusers. Indeed, when President Rouhani was elected in June 2013, there was a widespread but incorrect assumption that he was a moderate who would herald greater freedoms in Iran. But the regime's domestic repression has only intensified. Since last summer, the administration has not designated any individuals or entities for human rights abuses, and only 1 individual and 2 entities since Rouhani came to power in the summer of 2013. And now the administration reportedly is considering this new concession that, again, Iran did not explicitly negotiate as part of the JCPOA. This is direct or indirect access to dollarized transactions. This concession undercuts the effectiveness of our entire non-nuclear sanctions strategy, which depends on the private sector's fear of the risks involved in transacting with Iran. Allowing dollarized transaction aids Iran's push to legitimize its financial sector without ceasing the underlying terrorism proliferation, missile financing, and related money laundering and sanctions evasion. The Iran deal turned the regime from a nuclear pariah to a nuclear partner without having it come clean on its decades-long rap sheet of illegal weaponization activities. And it's important to understand that the regime is now seeking to follow the same legitimization strategy with respect to its illicit financial activity and human rights abuses. Iran should not be allowed to gain international acceptance without demonstrable changes in all of its dangerous behavior. And it's important, again, to understand that this has got to go far beyond a mere exercise in checking the box on technical requirements from the Financial Action Task Force relating to money laundering and terror financing, and it has to require fundamental and substantive changes in behavior. As long as Iran, for example, continues to fund Hezbollah, Iran should never be legitimized as a responsible financial actor. Congress can maintain its leverage by strengthening and implementing non-nuclear sanctions, and by considering some of the recommendations from my written testimony, which I'll summarize very quickly. Number 1, we need to protect the integrity of the U.S. dollar from Iranian illicit financial activity. We need to codify existing restrictions, require the administration to report on financial institutions involved in dollarization, and link these prohibitions to the end of terrorism and missile development, as well as compensation for victims of Iranian terrorism. There's still $53 billion in outstanding judgments. Number 2, designate the IRGC in its entirety under EO 13224 as a foreign terrorist organization. Number 3, impose sanctions on the IRGC, as well as sectors of the Iranian economy that are involved in Iran's ballistic missile development. Number 4, create an IRGC watch list to identify entities below the threshold for being owned or controlled by sanctioned entities. Number 5, expand these human rights sanctions to protect the Iranian people. 6, to target corruption, not only for money laundering, but also as a human rights abuse. And number 7, push back against Iran's legitimization campaign at FATF and elsewhere by exposing its threats to the global financial system. Let me conclude with this. Secretary Liu has argued that sanctions are an effective instrument to address illicit activities, but they must be lifted when the illicit behavior changes. This is a very important principle, but it misses a crucial detail. Iran has not addressed the underlying behavior that prompted many of the U.S. sanctions in the first place. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dubowitz. Now, Ms. Rosenberg.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today on the risks of economic engagement with Iran. The Iran sanctions regime was and remains the most comprehensive program of U.S. and international sanctions, commensurate with the grave security concerns regarding Iran's nuclear proliferation activities, its regional destabilization, ballistic missile programs, support for terrorism, and abuse of human rights. Many U.S. and international sanctions on Iran were waived on implementation day, the milestone of the nuclear deal recognizing Iran's completion of its major initial nuclear commitments. However, the United States maintains sanctions authorities relevant to Iran as part of the deal, as well as a wide array of sanctions on Iran outside the scope of the deal, as mentioned by my co-panelists and yourself as well. The existing architecture of Iran sanctions remains very powerful and affords an enormous amount of leverage to pursue Iranian security provocations and destabilization. Following implementation day, there are various reasons why Iran will expand its links to the international financial system only very slowly. The cumbersome unraveling of nuclear sanctions restrictions at banks and companies around the world in order to engage in now permitted business with Iran is only one factor. Remaining sanctions at Iran for its terrorist and ballistic missile activities are a deterrent to those who would contemplate business with Iran, along with prudential concerns related to a history of corruption, a lack of transparency, and maneuverability for foreign firms in Iran's financial system. Beyond remaining sanctions and Iran's self-imposed financial troubles, its escalating regional provocations and continued aggression through proxies make the specter of future confrontation with its neighbors or the United States a real possibility. Iran has the largest and most lethal ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East and has stepped up its missile tests in recent months, again, as has been mentioned. It has also expanded its material support to the Houthis in Yemen and continued to support other proxies that destabilize the region, including President Assad and Hezbollah. For reasons of political and security risk, the existing sanctions, and the serious financial challenges associated with attempting business in Iran, many global banks have made it clear that they do not plan on doing business with Iran. The banks and companies that will attempt it are generally moving slowly with contracts and deals, and they're biding their time to discover what market pitfalls or potential future sanctions may mean for their business. And furthermore, many of the banks that are doing so are regional banks with relatively smaller capacity to handle trade and structured finance and retail services. U.S. policymakers and European counterparts and others should publicly identify Iran's self-imposed financial problems. Doing so will make it clear to Iran and the global community that Iran bears significant responsibility for improving its own economic conditions, and that the removal of sanctions under the nuclear deal cannot independently deliver a windfall to Iran. The strongest and most credible strategy to highlight Iran's need to improve its financial transparency and accountability for its technical is for technical experts to point out the problems in the anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, counter-corruption, and prudential financial stability domains that Iran must address. Additionally, such experts should be encouraged and allowed, by license if they are U.S. persons, to offer technical guidance to Iran Iranian financial institutions to conduct this work. This will support U.S. policy interests in achieving greater transparency in the Iranian financial industry, and it will clearly demonstrate that the United States is not the roadblock to Iran's economic reform. It could also help to reinvigorate private business in Iran to better challenge the insidious control of the IRGC over significant parts of the Iranian economy. In pursuing Iran sanctions now and in the future, U.S. policymakers must prioritize the important work of isolating Iranian entities engaged in dangerous and illicit behavior through aggressive implementation of existing sanctions authorities. And they must balance this with educational outreach to highlight Iran's self-imposed financial problems and implementation of strategies to facilitate and encourage remediation of these problems by U.S. or foreign experts. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. Thank you. Mr. Zarate, the body that most everybody looks to when considering these issues is the Financial Action Task Force headquartered in Brussels. This is the body that is charged with countering money laundering worldwide. And they have been quite emphatic in their warnings on Iran, calling it a high-risk jurisdiction. As a matter of fact, 2 months ago, the organization said it was exceptionally concerned about Iran's failure to address the risk of terrorist financing and the serious threat that this poses to the integrity of the international financial system. But yesterday, a senior Treasury official appeared to suggest Iran might receive an improved rating from FATF, saying Iran should get credit for trying to come off that list. Is this a case of the U.S. working the refs? Are we beating up on the referee here? How would Iran get off the FATF blacklist, and do they deserve it?
It's a great question, Mr. Chairman. The FATF sometimes feels like a bit of a mysterious body to those who haven't seen it work from the inside. But as you said, it's the standard-setting body. It's the assessment body that looks at whether or not jurisdictions are abiding by international anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing systems. That is a technical body. And in being a technical body, they look at the formulaic responses and activities of governments, whether or not they've passed anti-terrorist financing laws, whether or not they have suspicious activity reporting requirements for their financial institutions, whether or not they have regulatory bodies that are inspecting compliance systems, et cetera. So there's a very technical dimension to this. Iran has been recalcitrant across the board. They have not engaged the FATF. They obviously don't have these kinds of laws and practices, and they clearly are a state sponsor of terror. So this is precisely why FATF for a number of years has held them to be a jurisdiction of high risk and has called on jurisdictions around the world to inform their financial institutions that Iran is highly suspect. What Iran has figured out, though, Mr. Chairman, is that this is a body that can be engaged with and is open to being engaged with, and we should, I think, be open to that as well. But the challenge here is, what reforms are we asking of Iran? Are they simply paper reforms that are not meaningful and don't address the real risks behind what Iran is doing? And I think this is going to be a challenge for FATF, because FATF, I think, wants to engage, and the U.S. Treasury wants to engage this process. But we certainly don't want to give Iran a free pass. And I don't think my former colleagues at the U.S. Treasury are going to whitewash this because they believe fundamentally in issues of financial integrity and protecting the international financial system. The real question here is, will Iran game the system? And we should not allow that to happen.
But, Mr. Zarate, Secretary Kerry is in London this morning. He and his British counterpart are meeting with the European bankers. There's a piece in the Financial Times about how the bankers are pushing back, the British major institutions saying, we don't want to invest there in Iran. They spoke of bridging a gap between the political intention of the agreement and how the banks are reacting. And Secretary Kerry noted that as long as banks do their normal due diligence and know who they're dealing with, then there won't be issues. But isn't the point of the international warnings on Iran and the Treasury's designation of the entire country as a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern, unquote, isn't that sending the message that due diligence can't even be done in this environment because of the corruption inside of the country and the system? The IRGC has nationalized most of the most of the major businesses. They're in the hands of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Mr. Chairman, you have it exactly right. And this is the fundamental tension in the JCPOA, which is an agreement in which we've promised the reintegration of Iran into the global financial and commercial system without demanding the change in the underlying conduct that has been the basis of their financial isolation. And I think what's happening now is the delta between that strategy of financial isolation for all of the things that Iran does, from terrorist support to ballistic missiles to the nuclear program. The nuclear issues are now off the table, but those other issues were not on the table. And so the challenge here is we have a system and a set of sanctions and a set of international requirements. By the way, U.S. requirements that have become global norms. The global norms are U.S. standards that demand a change in conduct and a change in behavior, and at a minimum require Iran to demonstrate that it is a legitimate actor in the system, that we can know what it's doing with its financial system, that we know the source of funds, that we understand the actors in the system. In fact, the Treasury just this past week in the wake of the Panama Papers has put out new regulations about customer due diligence, which heightens the standards around beneficial ownership and what we should know about with whom we're transacting and what we're transacting in. That goes doubly, triply for Iran. And so I haven't seen the full remarks of the Secretary, but I would say that it's a bit dangerous to suggest that all you have to do is engage in normal due diligence when talking about Iran, its behavior, and its history of using its financial and economic system for all of the nefarious conduct that they've been sanctioned for.
Well, let me go to Mr. Dubowitz for a short answer here, too, because I mentioned in my opening statement that we've had some success for now in pushing back on the administration's plans to allow Iran access to the U.S. dollar. But what is Iran's goal in getting access to the dollar? Is it the ease of doing business, or is Iran seeking to get the stamp of approval in international financial markets without making the changes to its banking practices or underlying behavior, which is transferring money directly into its missile program, the terrorism it funds, and so forth?
Well, Chairman Royce, it's both. I mean, Iran wants access to the U.S. dollar because the U.S. dollar is the global currency. It's responsible for something like 87% of global trade, 60% of foreign exchange reserves, and 40% of international financial transactions. On the other hand, Iran was actually getting paid for its oil under sanctions using euros and yen. So it is possible for Iran to actually transact internationally without access to the U.S. dollar. But the real reason they want access is exactly that. It's the stamp of approval. It's part of the legitimization strategy. It's to do what they did on the nuclear side. We're not going to come clean on our weaponization, but we're going to become a nuclear partner and a respectable international nuclear power. We're going to do the same thing on the financial side with the dollar.
Thank you, Mr. Dubowitz. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last year, when the agreement with Iran was announced, we were told that because we were removing sanctions on Iran for its nuclear program, it still did not preclude us from having sanctions on Iran for the other things they do, support of terrorism, ballistic missiles, whatever. The President wrote to our colleague, Congressman Nadler, last summer during the consideration of the nuclear deal with Iran, and the letter said, I quote, "Critically, I made sure that the United States reserved the right to maintain and enforce existing sanctions and even to deploy new sanctions to address those continuing concerns, which we fully intend to do when circumstances warrant." I'd like your opinion about what additional authority does the administration need now to crack down on Iran's terrible behavior? Would new non-nuclear sanctions violate the terms of the nuclear deal? Does the President have the authority now, enough authority now, to go after Iran for terrorism or for ballistic missiles? Or would Congress need to pass a law to give the President the authority? Mr. Dubowitz?
So, Ranking Member Engel, I mean, the President has always had the authority under IEPA to use executive orders to do whatever he wants with respect to Iran. But I think as Congress realized over the past at least decade, those authorities were insufficient without Congress playing an important role in passing statutes that actually sent a clear message to the international business community that if you did business with Iran and you did business with designated entities, that there would be secondary sanctions that would have a very powerful impact on your ability to then transact globally, and particularly with the United States. And I think it's critical to understand that Congress needs to play that role going forward with respect to non-nuclear sanctions. And one example would be on the ballistic missile side that you mentioned. I mean, it's absolutely clear there's 7, 8 sectors of Iran's economy that are providing key technology and parts and components to Iran's missile program. Now, does the President have the authority to designate those sectors of the economy? He does under existing EOs. But I think Congress can play a very important role in holding the administration's feet to the fire on identifying what sectors are playing a key role in Iran's ballistic missile program, and then imposing secondary sanctions on any foreign entities that are doing business with those sectors.
Thank you. Mr. Zarate, do you agree?
Absolutely. What's interesting, Congressman, is that not only is there the patchwork of Iran sanctions-related legislation and sanctions that Ms. Rosenberg talked about, but there's also a whole suite of executive orders based on IEPA that go to the underlying conduct that we're worried about with respect to Iran. I'll just give you a quick list. Terrorism, Executive Order 13224. Drug trafficking, multiple executive orders. Proliferation finance, signed by President Bush in 2005. The Cyber Executive Order, signed by President Obama April 1 of last year. The Transnational Organized Crime Executive Order. Human rights-related elements of IEPA provisions. The Syria sanctions and executive order. The Yemen executive order. So you go down the line in terms of all of the conduct that we're worried about with respect to Iran. Not only does the administration have the existing authority based on Iran legislation and Iran sanctions, but you also have the ability to affect the underlying conduct based on the way we've applied sanctions aggressively over the last 15 years. It also underscores why the question of Iranian conduct is so important, because we've built the sanctions program that has been so effective on Iran and other targets of these measures around the underlying conduct that they're engaged in. And if they're not changing their behavior, they remain subject to those sanctions as well as the international program. So my answer to you is we have existing authorities. The administration has plenty of authority with which to work. And to Mark's point, I think Congress's role, is to help clarify the lines of where that authority is and, frankly, where the threats still lie from Iran.
Thank you. Ms. Rosenberg, you warn against limitations, and I quote you, that could, quote, undermine the attractiveness or primacy of the U.S. financial system and the dollar as a reserve currency. So let me ask you, what are the risks to the U.S. financial system if oil trade were to be done in, say, euros instead of dollars? With the amount of dollars in circulation compared to euros or other currencies, is it even possible to shift to other currencies? And finally, what would be the impact of restrictions on the use of the dollar on the 2 U.S. clearance systems, which are Fedwire and CHIPS, and U.S. surveillance of financial flows?
Thank you for the question. It's hard to contemplate the trade of oil not in dollars. It's a massive market, it's highly liquid, and it's overwhelmingly done in the dollar. And even though conversation about de-dollarizing oil transactions has been ongoing for quite a long time, it's difficult to think how that would occur. If, however, there was a substantial amount of oil trade that did occur not in the U.S. dollar, it would, of course, reduce the amount of flow through U.S. clearing mechanisms, financial institutions, of course, which reduces the amount of activity and revenue they can collect there. And also, in addition to physical trade in oil, there's also a tremendous market in what's called paper trade or financial trade, sometimes called speculative trade in oil, that occurs around the physical trading. It occurs mostly in the United States because oil is denominated in dollars, and that business represents a huge amount of commerce that would not be in the United States if a majority or a significant amount of trade moved to a different currency and was therefore cleared in a different jurisdiction. And that's something that, as a key global commodity, as a major global commodity market, should be of interest and concern for people who watch markets, market activity, and the opportunity for raising business in the United States. Essentially, the same is true when you're thinking about Forex transactions or other dollar clearing for those U.S. platforms that clear that in the United States.
Thank you very much.
We go to Eliana Ross-Layton in Florida.
Thank you so much, Chairman Royce, and thank you for your continued efforts to highlight the dangers of the Iranian nuclear deal and the many ways in which the administration has and continues to deceive Congress and the American people when it comes to implementing this agreement. It seems every week there's a new revelation that was previously undisclosed or some new concessions that the administration is offering to the regime that was not part of the agreement. Every time Iran threatens to walk away from the deal over perceived slights, the administration caves to Iranian demands. And the regime knows that it can continue to use this tactic and get what it wants because President Obama is intent at maintaining this weak and dangerous deal, even if it means allowing the Iranians to undermine the intent and the letter of the JCPOA. Now we're hearing the administration backtracking on claims that it would not allow Iran access to the U.S. financial system and is actively working to ensure that Iran does indeed get its sanctions relief, and that was not part of the deal. So how would the administration go about giving Iran access, either directly or indirectly, access to the U.S. dollar and our financial system, and what would that access mean for Iran's coffer? And turning to the IRGC, we know that the IRGC controls a large portion of the Iranian economy, owning the country's largest construction company, its main telecommunications company, and controlling as much as 25% of the Tehran Stock Exchange. It controls and owns banks. The officials sit on and control the boards of private companies and is the primary player in Iran's infrastructure and increasingly its energy sector. We know that the IRGC is largely responsible for the development of Iran's ballistic missile program, as well as overseeing the Quds Force, the asymmetric war and terror operators who are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American servicemen and women and countless others, other individuals worldwide. What sort of impact would Iran getting access to our dollar and financial system have on the IRGC and the Quds Force? Why has the administration not designated the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization? And more importantly, what do you suggest that what steps we could take to limit the IRGC's financial growth? And what impact would Iran getting access to the U.S. dollar have on its ballistic missile program, its support for Hezbollah, et cetera? Lots of questions. You can answer any one of them. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So, Congressman Ross-Layton, thank you for those questions. First of all, the way the administration would give access to the U.S. dollar, it's important to understand that the administration is committed not to give Iran access to the U.S. financial system, but the Treasury officials have been very clear that that means U-turn transactions to the U.S. financial system. My concern is that they're going to give dollarized transactions. They're going to give access to the U.S. dollar offshore. And why this is important is because getting access to the U.S. dollar means that it facilitates international financial transactions. So most importantly, it actually, again, as Chairman Royce said, it's a stamp of approval on Iran. It is part of their legitimization strategy. They can say, well, if the United States of America is green-lighting the greenback, then FATF shouldn't have us on the blacklist, sort of throw out so many colors. But that is their strategy, their financial legitimization strategy. And this really benefits the IRGC, which ultimately is not going to work directly through designated IRGC entities. It's going to work through cutouts and front companies. And those cutouts and front companies are going to be controlled by the IRGC, either through share ownership or boards of directors, and they are going to be able to use the US dollar.
I'll give that 1 minute to anyone else who would like to.
Can I respond too? I just, as a point of clarification, it is not practically possible to do a lot of dollar activity in large transactions or a large number of transactions outside of the U.S. financial system without using a U.S. financial institution. And that is because at some point, those dollars need to be cleared through a U.S. financial system. It's impossible not to, possibly you could aggregate them over a period of time, but even as an omnibus clearing activity, that would occur. So It is in
Thank
fact,
you. Mr. Zarate, you've got 30 seconds. Thank you, ma'am.
I think one of the dangers, Congresswoman, is that you incentivize systems to actually be created. So even if there aren't existing sort of volumes and systems, you actually incentivize actors to create offshore dollar clearing systems that facilitate IRGC activity and, frankly, then allow them to hide some of their activity even further. One really important point here, too, is if we allow this concession in the context of the spirit of the deal, we will be conceding that access to the dollar is actually a part of the nuclear sanctions-related relief.
Thank you.
That then doesn't allow us to use non-access to the dollar as a tool for all the other activity that's important.
Good point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Brad Sherman from Los Angeles.
We've got to straighten out the difference between being pro-Iran deal, and there are many reasonable people who've taken that position, and pro-Iran. And those of us who criticize the Iran deal cannot create a political circumstance where the defenders of the deal feel they need to not only defend the deal, which can be done with some credibility, but to defend Iran. And what we should be talking about is to demand full compliance with the deal and ourselves not over-comply and give to the Iranians more than they bargained for. There is, of course, those in the United States who would take military action against Iran, and those who are repelled by the idea of military action in general and specifically in the Middle East. But those who object to that does not mean that that letting Iran do what it wants ought to be the position of liberals and others whose instinctive belief is peace. Iran is taking its thugs to Syria and killing people by the hundreds every week. And those who believe in peace have got to realize that they have no allies in Tehran. Energy prices. The current global decline has led to a significant pullback in investments in energy worldwide. For global energy companies, what are the factors guiding their decisions on investing in Iran? Can Iran offer itself as an attractive place to invest at a time when you cannot be assured of getting more than $30 for a barrel of oil?
Can I
Ms.
respond?
Rosenberg, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Iran is it's an interesting case for large international companies, and particularly for independent companies, not national-owned companies. They need to replace their reserves. They're looking for big, good opportunities to seek the opportunity to produce. Iran is one such place if you look at it from the perspective of its geology, the lack of technical difficulty in being able to produce the oil.
What is the lifting cost of Iranian oil?
In the single digits. In the single digits. So by comparison to much U.S. production, which is not economically liftable today under an oil price in the mid-40s and higher.
Gotcha.
So this is, in the world, amongst the lowest global prices for lifting. Nevertheless, the difficulty by comparison to the ease of the geology and the lifting costs is the difficulty in making contracts with the Iranian government. The IPC, their contract, hasn't been finalized yet. They can't agree on it. That's an immediate problem. Additionally, making payments, sourcing equipment, there are incredible...
Is there anything we could do to make it even harder, other than fuel-efficient automobiles and low oil usage?
It's harder even than, yes, it's harder even than what I mentioned, too. The collapse
Rather than describe how hard it is there do you have any suggestions for making it even harder?
for them to produce, there's nothing...
And to get oil companies to invest?
There's nothing that the U.S. government could do more powerful than the collapse in oil prices, which have shut global oil companies out of sanctioning any kind of major energy project anywhere in the world.
Does anybody have any suggestions as to, no, obviously we can't match the decline in oil prices, but any suggestions as to how we can make it tougher, Mr. Dubowitz?
Well, one of the things that I think would be interesting, actually, is to look at the Saudis and other Gulf countries. and let them use their enormous economic leverage to put international companies to a choice between doing business in Iran's energy sector or doing business in their energy sector. I mean, that would be market-based economic and financial warfare that would have nothing to do with sanctions. It would have to do with economic leverage being used by the
I want to
Saudis
go
and
on
Emiratis.
to aircraft. Obviously, Iran Air is in a position to buy American aircraft. That was a bad part of the JCPOA, but Mahan Air is still designated as a terrorist organization. I hope colleagues here will be receiving a letter from me soon about urging the EU to designate Mahan Air under its terrorism sanctions, and of course to urge the Ukraine, which is so seeking so much American support, to not allow Mahan Air to land in Kiev. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sherman. We go now to Mr. Joe Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having witnesses here on such an important issue. And it's somewhat startling. I think the American people need to know the threats that are still coming out of Iran and the threats to American families, and somehow an agreement that really just, I think, promotes it, obviously, with the funding. And Mr. Dubowitz, in particular, I want to thank you for your service as Executive Director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. You make a difference promoting freedom worldwide. And Mr. Dubowitz, with the talk surrounding the administration's decision to purchase heavy water from the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, I want to note that the last facility to produce heavy water domestically was at the Savannah River site in Aiken, South Carolina. Nearly all of the commercial nuclear reactors in the United States use light water, and the purchase of 32 tons of heavy water from Iran represents nearly half of the United States' total imports of this material, which usually comes from our great allies, Canada and India. I appreciate Chairman Ed Royce, who has questioned this purchase, inquiring what guarantees there are that the money wouldn't be used to promote and fund terrorism. Mr. Dubowitz, are there any guarantees at all?
None at all. There are none at all, and the other thing that is remarkable is that we're actually paying the Iranians to perfect their ability to produce heavy water, so that when all the restrictions on heavy water production, reprocessing, and the plutonium pathway to nuclear weapon go away over time, the Iranians will actually have all of that time funded by us in order to perfect the essential element of a plutonium bomb. So I don't know why we're facilitating that and paying for that.
And thank you for being so clear. And the American people need to know this. And it's just, to me, the whole thing is bizarre. And how in the world we got this place. And then, Mr. Zarate, your testimony, too, has been so insightful and clear. Thank you. Sometimes diplomats come across a bit obfuscating. There are a number of senior Iranian officials that are complicit in human rights abuses, brutal treatment of the Iranian people. The administration has not sanctioned individuals such as Iran's interior minister or the head of judiciary. Has there been any change in Iran since the deal was agreed to?
None. None that's visible, none that's been demonstrated. There's been a lot of hope in the parliamentary elections, but that, I think, is a bit of a false hope. And we've seen none of those detained, including the leaders of the Green Movement, those individuals remain detained. And I think we have bent over backwards, both through the negotiating process and even now, to not appear to be instigating or aggravating the Iranians. And I think that has muted our voice, whether it's at the start of the Green Movement or even now.
Congressman, if I could just add to that.
Yes.
2015 was a record year for executions in Iran. The human rights situation has gotten worse, not better. That's not me saying that. That's Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights. And yet, the administration, as I said, since Rouhani came to power in 2013, they've only sanctioned one individual and two entities for human rights abuses. What is the rationale for not imposing human rights abuses on the instruments of repression and the individuals who are engaged in these human rights abuses? If the administration is serious about non-nuclear sanctions and serious about protecting the Iranian people, why has it been so remiss in using its existing authorities on human rights abuses?
And thank both of you for referencing the Green Movement. The people of Iran deserve better. And so thank you for promoting that. And Mr. Dubowitz, and back right on point what you said, instead of the administration trying to encourage companies to do business with Iran, shouldn't be the focus be on cracking down on corruption, which is robbing the Iranian people? And what is Iran's current involvement with terrorist groups?
Well, again, Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. They support Hezbollah, they support Hamas, they support designated Iraqi Shiite militias, and they're obviously involved in the slaughter in Syria. And I think your point on corruption is exactly right. I mean, corruption is a human rights crime as well. Dictators use the fruits of corruption in order to both keep power and as instruments of repression. And I think that's something that actually has been widely acknowledged by the U.S. government and by Assistant Secretary Danny Glazer in a number of speeches. And that corruption needs to be addressed through existing authorities, and if existing authorities are insufficient and clarification is needed, Congress needs to make it clear that corruption is not only a money laundering concern, but it's a human rights concern, and actually crack down on those individuals involved in corruption.
And again, as we conclude, thank you, all three of you, for raising these issues that are so important to American families.
Mr. David Cicilline from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. The argument was advanced during our consideration of the JCPOA that successful implementation of the agreement with rigorous enforcement to ensure full compliance of the deal would put us in a stronger position to push back on Iran, and now a non-nuclear Iran, in the other areas. And there were even predictions from many we heard from that there would be likely an increase in their nefarious and thuggish behavior as a response to the more extreme parts of the regime after the deal was struck, as a way to sort of reassure them that they were still in control. And I think, based on the testimony today and my own reading, that's what we're seeing, a additional destabilizing activity. And so my first question really is, do we read anything out of the election and the runoff election results in April? And some have suggested that there's some evidence that the reformers have made some progress, and that bodes well for the future. Can anyone comment whether we should read anything into the election results?
Well, I think, first of all, it wasn't an election, it was a selection. 90% or over 90% of reformers were disqualified from running. The lists that were actually assembled for the parliamentary elections were lists where hardliners were included as moderates. So it was a great marketing job, but it didn't fundamentally change the power structure within Iran. And I think if we've learned anything from the revelations on Ben Rhodes, the U.S. government and the U.S. intelligence community doesn't believe that the Iranian regime is moderate in any way, and doesn't believe that Rouhani is a moderate. And so that this whole moderate meme has maybe been a fiction of our imaginations rather than an accurate description of the interfactional power balance within the Iranian government.
So are there...
If I could add,
I'm sorry.
if I could add to that, it's true that these most recent elections are notable for trying to test the wind, if you will, in Iran and what's happening with the popular sentiment. Nevertheless, the upcoming presidential election for Rouhani may be a better signpost to us. So we don't have that data yet. We won't for quite a while until his election, he stands again for election. But that may be a better sign for us about the popular sentiment and the control of the supreme leader over that revolutionary economy.
Thank you. And I'd ask each of the panelists, are there any risks that you see to passing new sanctions, even if they're outside the JCPOA? Does the administration need additional authority, or is it just not using the authority it currently has? And maybe you can answer that first, and I have a follow-up question. Yes.
You're right. The administration does not need additional authorities. Mr. Zarate went through a number of authorities that the administration does have, from support to Syria, Yemen, transnational organized crime, cyber, proliferation, terrorism. That covers a huge scope, and furthermore, there's the opportunity for iterations of those through various prongs within them for derivative designations. The danger that comes from additional sanctions is if there's an opportunity to set up statutes or language definitions that don't match, creating confusion for the private sector. As was mentioned previously, I've warned about the concerns of diminishing the attractiveness of the US dollar, that great power we do have that was spoken about by Mr. Dubowitz as well. And to the extent that we support and care about the proliferation security gains that have been accomplished in the nuclear deal, if imposing additional sanctions that reimpose sanctions that were lifted occurs and it undermines the deal, that could be a tremendous setback for proliferation security concerns.
Mr. Dubowitz?
Yeah, if I could just make a quick comment. I mean, we heard this debate for 10 years. Congress heard this debate from the administration that they had all the existing authorities that they needed, but you still passed CISADA and ITRA and IFCA and NDAA. So I think that this argument has been a long-standing argument. I think what Congress has realized is that, A, you can impose secondary sanctions, which are a very powerful way to complement the executive orders, and B, through reporting language and clarification language, you can begin to hold the administration accountable for its commitments to impose non-nuclear sanctions, which again are not a contravention of the JCPOA, but as Secretary Kerry said, they're very much consistent with using all national security tools against Iran's destabilizing behavior. So again, Congress has played a critical role in the Iran debate, and I think Congress can continue to do so through new statutes.
Yes, sir.
Congressman, I think Congress acts and the administration acts with great authority when the sanctions are based in fact, based on real activity of concern, and certainly are in furtherance of not just U.S. law, but international norms. If the sanctions appear to be arbitrary and capricious and simply reimposing prior sanctions or capriciously targeting individuals because we don't like them, that's problematic. I think when there is actual substantive concern about the real risks, and those have been identified by both Congress and the administration, that's incredibly powerful and frankly can't be disputed. And one final point here, you know, Iran has emerged out from under many of these sanctions into a new world of heightened expectations for global financial transparency. They're starting at a very low bar. We should do everything possible to force them to the standards that now exist in 2016, because those are very real standards, and there are very real risks if they don't meet them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for this hearing. You know, how can anyone in America trust anything the administration says at this point? They misled the American people about the Affordable Care Act. They misled the American people about the attacks in Benghazi and the motivation behind those attacks. They misled the American people about the IRS's targeting of conservative groups. And now we see they've misled the American people over the Iran deal, as evidenced by Ben Rhodes' comments in the New York Times article this week, confirmed in the Washington Post article where the administration pushed a certain narrative, misled not only the American people, misled the media, who in turn misled the American people. And even White House spokesman Josh Earnest couldn't find the words to deny the administration misled you, America. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to reiterate my call for the State Department to provide to this committee and the Committee on Homeland Security a white paper referenced in their memo as they implemented the Visa Waiver Program Improvement and Terrorist Travel Prevention Act, which they're using to circumvent the will of Congress and the letter of the law to allow foreigners that have traveled to Iran and other areas of the world that host terrorists to have access to the Visa Waiver Program. There was a white paper reference in their justification. We asked Secretary Kerry in this committee. We've sent letters to the Department of State. We've asked the Department of State officials and Homeland Security Committee for a copy of that white paper that they used to circumvent Congress and to circumvent the law. So I reiterate my call for that. Mr. Zarate, how much money would Iran have access to with this Iranian deal, unfrozen assets? Let's just talk about unfrozen assets for just a second.
Yeah, Congressman, the estimates have been anywhere between $70 billion to $150 billion, and obviously we've heard—
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And I've estimated, and I've said this before in testimony, that there are likely assets that are unaccounted for. Those are known assets, largely central bank reserves.
And expanding Iranian economy with sanctions being lifted, their ability to sell their oil in the open market, not the black market, would enhance that number somewhat.
Absolutely, and that does not include the growth of their economy and
exactly. So let me read the Ayatollah Khamenei's words after this deal was struck. Whether the deal is approved or disapproved, we will never stop supporting our friends in the region and the people of Palestine, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Bahrain, and Lebanon. Basically, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism, financially and with material support. And with his own words, they're going to continue to support those terrorists. His own words. With $150 billion and an expanding economy, that's a heck of a lot of money to support terrorism. Should the free world be concerned?
Absolutely, and it's precisely why we shouldn't be giving Iran any special exemptions or special access to the dollar, be it onshore or offshore. I mean, we should expect, and we know, not only from what the Iranians have said, but also what the terrorists have said. You know, Hassan Nasrallah himself said that we expect continued and expanded support from the Iranians. And so we know that's going to happen. We know that there's an increased risk, a very real risk of flows of millions, if not billions of dollars to Iranian proxies. We've seen with the interdiction of shipments to Yemen by international naval forces, including U.S. forces, that they're trying to send arms into Yemen to the Houthi rebels, acting as their proxies. So we know this is happening.
They're active in Iraq. They're active
it's
in
not just what
Syrian
they
civil
say.
war.
We see it on the ground. We understand it. We hear what their allies say. And so it's a real risk.
Yeah, let me reclaim my time. I chair the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. And we've had hearings and we've been very vocal about the presence of Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere. General Kelly, former commander of Southcom, has testified about his concern of Iran's activity in the Western Hemisphere. Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. Iran's active here. Cultural centers and areas in Latin America that don't have really strong Islamic ties or Muslim populations. We know that the tri-border region between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil is very active in Hezbollah. If Hezbollah is in the Western Hemisphere and Iran has $150 billion to support their friends, Hezbollah and Hamas and the others that the Ayatollah himself mentioned, would reason not speak to the fact that they may support Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere and their own activity, Iran's activity, in the Western Hemisphere that could target American interests or the interest of our friends and allies closer to home? Not the Middle East, but here in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. Is that fair to assume?
That's absolutely fair, and it's not just in the tri-border area. It's in places like Venezuela, where there have been traditional and commercial ties between the Iranian government and the Venezuelan government.
You know,
and
Caracas, Air Tehran, Air Terror, whatever,
exactly.
the flights.
Not to mention the expansive Hezbollah network, which the U.S. Treasury and the DEA have been exposing as a global criminal enterprise in Latin America, in West Africa, which is part of this infrastructure that Iran can tap into and certainly support with financing. One other point I will just say, a friend and colleague of mine, Alberto Nisman, the Argentine prosecutor, I believe was murdered, in part because he was investigating not just the attacks from Iranian-sponsored terrorism in Buenos
92
Aires,
and 94,
but
correct.
also looking at where Iran had presence in South America and in Latin America.
Right. And just for the committee's awareness, the gentleman, the Iranian that was implicated in those attacks,
Right.
was supposed to come to Colombia and may still lead a delegation to Colombia, should be arrested by Interpol. That is how close to home this is. With that, I'll yield back.
And that's Mohsen Rabbani for those folks at Interpol who are paying attention.
Yes, we will make this discussion available to Interpol and talk to the government in Colombia. Let's go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is our 30th hearing on Iran. And I don't know that this committee has cloaked itself in glory on the subject. We beat dead horses, and we've been proved wrong, I think. I'm going to ask Ms. Rosenberg. Ms. Rosenberg, the JCPOA, the agreement that was completely decried and opposed by my friends on the other side of the aisle and some members of my own party. Let me see. One of the requirements was that all uranium enrichment levels had to be reduced to 3.67%. Has that happened?
The IAEA has certified that by the beginning of this year, in January, Iran had met all of its major basic nuclear commitments, which is the basis for...
I know, but indulge me one by one. So 3.67%, yes or no?
Yes, I believe so.
Did they, in fact, remove the core of the Iraq heavy water research reactor and fill it with concrete?
Cement, yes.
Did they reduce their stockpile of previously enriched uranium by 95%?
Yes.
Did they ship it out of the country?
Yes, removed.
Did they subject their centrifuge production in uranium mines and mills to surveillance by outside international nuclear inspectors?
Yes, and their reports have been made public.
And did they reduce the number of centrifuges as required under the by the agreement?
Yes.
Anything they cheated on that we know of?
Not that we know of.
Not that we know of. Really? Now, I don't know. I'm not a nuclear expert, but if they met all of those metrics, and we're supposed to believe that this was a smokescreen to allow Iran to become to give it a, quote, patient pathway to the bomb. It looks to me like that's not a patient pathway to a bomb. That actually reverses the development of a bomb. Would that be a fair statement from your point of view?
Yes. If I may add to
Of
that,
course.
additionally, I don't think, however, given the grave concerns that the international community has had about Iran's demonstrated proliferation activities, that achieving that milestone, those milestones we've just gone through, should give anyone any comfort that this is the end of the road.
Of course.
Right. So, which is one reason, of course, why this nuclear agreement goes on much longer than just implementation day, and why many people correctly believe that this should be a strengthening of the international nonproliferation regime, not just for Iran, but for any other state of proliferation concern.
Right. But we know it's a fallacy and reason to argue because it isn't absolute, forever, perfect. We therefore should not do it. Sometimes we take incremental progress, real incremental progress, that takes the immediate and short-term existential threat and reduces it or reverses it significantly. That's better than the alternative, is it not?
I think many people feel seriously reassured, very sincerely reassured, that Iran is further today from a nuclear bomb and nuclear warheads on its ballistic missiles arsenal than it was only a number of months ago.
And I think they should be, because objectively they are.
I agree.
And that doesn't mean, however, the threat's removed. It doesn't mean that we're not going to face all kinds of other problems in the relationship, and it doesn't mean that 15 or 20 years hence they might want to reevaluate and reverse the commitments they've made in this agreement. God forbid, and that's what we've got. But we've bought some time, and we didn't just buy time and freeze it in place. We reversed it. And according to your testimony, and you're not the first to testify here, to best of our knowledge, they've met every metric. It's really interesting to me that we want to talk about everything but compliance, having, of course, predicted that they wouldn't comply.
I think it's appropriate to talk about, and I assume you'd agree, to talk about these other issues of concern related to Iran. But,
absolutely.
But nevertheless, very important to distinguish between nuclear oversight of this nuclear deal and these other concerns.
Listen, I'm old enough to have lived through the Cold War. We had nuclear agreements with our bitter enemy that had promised to wipe us from the face of the earth, the Soviet Union. That didn't stop us from negotiating under multiple administrations with Moscow, starting with John Kennedy after the Cuban Missile Crisis, of all things. The first nuclear test ban treaty, he negotiated with Khrushchev. We are capable of looking at multiple compartments and manipulating them to our advantage where we can. And this is a good example. I yield back.
We go now to Mr. Randy Weber of Texas.
I would follow up that by saying that the Russians weren't strapping dynamite vests on kids and killing people in other countries, but that's just me. Mr. Dubowitz, I think in your exchange with Congressman Duncan, you didn't get to finish your last idea. Would you like to take time to do that now?
Congressman, a couple things. One is I would just make it clear that with respect to the Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah, the fact that there are Boeing and Airbus now signing or trying to sign multi-billion-dollar deals with Iran Air, I would say that it is incumbent upon those companies, and I would argue impossible for those companies not to ensure that the technologies that they're providing to Iran Air are not going to end up in the hands of IRGC Air, which is Mahan Air. And I think that those agreements are incredibly difficult to enforce, and that the due diligence will be exceptionally difficult to actually undertake. I would also actually take some exception to the exchange. Iran is in flagrant violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which was the implementation resolution for the JCPOA, which replaced all the previous 6 UN Security Council resolutions, because it is engaged in multiple missile tests for long-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. Capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. A nuclear weapon is not just enrichment. A nuclear weapon is also a warhead, and it is also the delivery vehicle, which is the missile. So, Congressman Connolly, Iran is in flagrant violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, and that should give us some serious pause.
Well, and thank you for saying that. Let me point out that my good friend from California earlier said that liberals, it was their, I believe, their instinctive inclination to peace, and I just want to ask, did he say instinctive or was it extinctive? We need to be careful, because you're dealing with a regime that would take every opportunity to be in flagrant violation, to use your words, not only on all of the sending of, as I point out, terrorism in other countries, kids, dynamite, strapping on, blowing up people, their commitment to destroying Israel, the United States ultimately. I think we should take them seriously. So I appreciate, for one, y'all being here and pointing out that we need, I had this conversation with John Kerry, we should have made them prove that they wanted to be good world community neighbors, if that's the right word, by doing all of these things in a period of time. They've been bad actors since 1979 when they took the hostages in Tehran. That's 30, back then, last year it was 36 years ago. Half of that time would be 18 years, a fourth of that time would be 9 years, an eighth of that time would be 4.5 years, a 16th of that time would be 2 years, basically. Couldn't we just make them comply for 2 years to prove they were serious, to prove that they were willing to be good community neighbors? I mean, the whole JCPOA was absolutely a travesty, in my opinion. That's my opinion. But anyway, I wanted to ask you all for your opinions while you're here. 3 things. I want to know 3 things to apply pressure on Iran. How do we apply pressure, in your opinion, Mr. Dubowitz? Just give us 3 short things that we could make them comply as closely as possible. What would you do specifically? Or give me 1 or 2 things.
I would require the administration to report to Congress on the sectors of Iran's economy that are providing key technology, personnel.
That's not going to happen. I don't trust this administration to report to us. I'm sorry, I just don't. What can we do as a Congress?
So you could ask GAO to do the same report, and GAO would then look at other organizations that have done similar reports. We've done a report on Iran's missile sector. Look at the sectors of the economy. Congress could then pass legislation, or in fact, the legislation.
What can we do? It's Mark, right? Your first name is Mark?
Mark, yeah.
What can we do, Mark, to cut off funding the House of Representatives, if we would have guts, so that when they want to use access to United States financial institutions, we as the United States Congress, I know it would have to begin in the House of Representatives, what could we do to shut down their access to the U.S. financial institutions?
So again, I think, and Juan and Liz have talked about this, I mean, the best thing you can do is appeal to the market. The best thing that you can do is create this risk overhang that already is there, and you can amplify it. Require companies and financial institutions to report to the SEC if they're doing business with IRGC entities, not just designated IRGC entities, but entities that are on an IRGC watch list, the GAO or CRS or independent organizations could provide. By creating market risk, what you're going to do is you're going to do what Juan talked about, which is you're going to focus on the conduct, the illicit conduct that Iran is engaged in, and you can shine a spotlight on that. That does more to change market calculations by millions of actors than anything.
Out of time, but let me follow up by this, and I'm not going to be able to get to the other 2. How do we bring our friends on board with that, whether it's Britain, whether whoever it is? How do we bring our allies on board with that?
Well, our allies need access to the U.S. market. Many of our allies have financial institutions with correspondent banking relationships in the United States. Many of our allies have companies that are traded on U.S. exchanges. So I would go around the governments and I would appeal to the companies. British banks today don't want to go back into Iran, despite the fact the British government is trying to strong arm them back into Iran because they care about U.S. market access, they care about their reputations, and they don't want to be doing business with the Revolutionary Guards and entities and a state that is engaged in such illicit and dangerous conduct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. We go to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I'd like to thank you and Ranking Member Engel for your enduring commitment to ensure that this committee continues to provide oversight on the nuclear deal and remains engaged and vigilant on all of Iran's troubling activities. For much of the week, Secretary Kerry has been quoted in the press as proclaiming that Iran is open for business, and that, as a U.S. official, is quoted as saying, it is in fact not U.S. sanctions, but Iran's bad banking practices, along with its ballistic missile launches, support for terrorism, and human rights abuses, including, I might add, a long history of arresting foreign businessmen that make it an unfriendly business climate. And I would agree that every single company that is considering doing new business in Iran should be deeply concerned by and should consider all of these factors before making any deal. The Washington Post yesterday reported that fear of running afoul of continued U.S. sanctions for all of these other bad behaviors is preventing banks and businesses from dealing with Iran. I hope that in his travels, Secretary Kerry is making clear to our allies that not only will those sanctions remain in place and be enforced with vigor, but they too should be enforcing these sanctions as they are not covered under the JCPOA. Let's be clear here. If Iran wants business, it's up to the regime to change its behavior. Now, the Washington Post also reported that detention of foreign citizens is another reason businesses are and should be wary of re-entering Iran. And I would urge these companies to give deep consideration to the fact that the longest-held American hostage in history disappeared in Iran. Robert Levinson went missing in Iran on March 9th, 2007, and he is still not home. And more importantly, Iran is still not providing information as to his whereabouts. And I hope that Secretary Kerry has raised the issue of Bob Levinson in every one of his meetings with foreign banks and foreign businesses. And I hope that every single oil company, airplane manufacturer, construction company that meets with Iranian officials raises Bob Levinson's case. I hope that every one of these businesses, as they contemplate their challenges to doing business in Iran, contemplate the fact that Bob Levinson has been missing for 9 years and makes this an issue in those discussions. And they should be demanding that if Iran wants foreign investment to return, that it should begin to prove itself a responsible actor by fulfilling its oft-stated pledge of cooperating and providing information on Bob's whereabouts and in helping to return him to his family. And I might add, I hope that in the reports in the press that our great media who are following these issues so closely, whether or not businesses want to re-engage in Iran, will also raise in their discussions the fact that Bob Levinson is the longest-held American hostage and that Iran has not provided the necessary information to help bring him home. Mr. Dubowitz, I understand that it may be unusual business practice for a company to engage with a government in areas that are commonly left to diplomats. But why should all of these companies looking to re-enter Iran, why should they care about Iran's human rights abuses? Why should they care about Iran's support for terrorism? And why, to follow on my opening statement, why should they be concerned about an American who's been missing, went missing in Iran more than 9 years ago?
Congressman Deutsch, I think for two fundamental reasons. Reason number one is that the next hostage that could be taken is them. The CEO or the director of business development for the Middle East for a major oil company or major financial institution could be the next hostage because Iran takes hostages as part of its standard operating procedure. And the second reason is because these international companies have reputations, and those reputations are worth billions of dollars. And to have a reputation of doing business with a hostage-taking, genocide-threatening, nuclear-building, missile-testing, Holocaust-denying regime is just bad fundamentally for business.
Mr. Chairman, I would, before yielding back, I would just say again, the members of this committee are probably tired of hearing me talk at every single committee hearing, every meeting we have on Iran, about my constituent who needs to be returned to his family. But it's just inconceivable to me that all of the stories we've been reading this week have focused on whether or not Iran should be open for business, on whether or not other countries should worry about sanctions and going back into do business deals in Iran, without mentioning Bob Levinson's name. I don't understand it. There is an American who's been missing for more than 9 years. Everybody should care about Bob Levinson. And I yield back.
For the record, Congressman, we do not get tired of hearing about that. Thank you. And the chair now recognizes Scott Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dubowitz, Mr. Zarate, can you tell me, in your opinion, I know this might be a little off target for the hearing, but is Iran's ballistic missile capability currently prepared to deliver whatever payload that it might desire to put on it, whether nuclear or otherwise, beyond, I don't know, several hundred miles? Do they currently have that capability on a consistent basis?
Well, they certainly have the capability to, in terms of range.
Right.
The question is, do they have the capability to affix a nuclear warhead to those missiles?
With a triggering device. That's in question, right?
Right, that's the question.
So that's the continued testing that we see of the ballistic missiles. That's what
Right.
we're working on.
And the danger on the warhead side is, I mean, again, Congressman Connolly seems to think that the Iranians are in such full compliance. But on warhead issues, we don't know.
Right.
Because warhead design is done in a room basically this size.
Right.
And we don't even know if we are going to have access to military sites where that warhead design is likely to take place.
I'm going to get to another question, but I just want to make the point, while Mr. Connolly feels that they're in compliance, and of course you've already elucidated the fact that they're not in compliance or in flagrant violation of Resolution 2231, I would remind him that we'll have the same conversation in 10 to 15 years when Iran has consolidated its gains in Yemen, Libya, Iraq, if I didn't say Yemen already, Syria, et cetera, and has also perfected its ballistic missile technology. Will be within months of breakout, right where it was when we left off, when they left off of nuclear device, an armed warhead, and also have the air defense artillery from Russia to protect all that stuff. And we will be able to do very little about it, just like we can do with North Korea right now. And I'll revisit the conversation with Mr. Connolly at that time. That having been said, let me ask you folks this, because we're talking about financial transactions. In addition to the sanctions risk, there is a considerable risk to companies entering Iran from a business perspective. For example, Iran banks will have to adjust to tougher international regulations and may need to offload non-performing loans into a bad bank. Many of Iran's banks are still struggling after piling up bad debt during the more than a decade-long sanctions era, several banks having exposure to the country's property market, which turned sour in 2012, leaving problem loans in the system, compounding the situation. Thus, the Iranian financial sector is in a precarious situation. Official data showed that ratio of non-performing loans to total loans was 13.4% in the Iranian month ending of June 21st, 2015. Market estimates point to nearly double that figure, with the equivalent of $40 billion at the top end of estimates for non-performing loans. Since the 2008 financial crisis, most banks must adhere to international capital standards known as Basel III, which require them to bolster their balance sheets. Iran remains a command economy dominated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, to include the banking sector. While the Secretary's running around telling everybody it's going to be fine to invest in Iran, I just want to know how significant the reforms would be for Iranian banks to meet international banking standards, particularly with Basel III. Gentlemen, I would like to hear from them, if you could, first.
I haven't looked at the balance sheets currently, but you're absolutely right that one of the questions that any institution going into Iran has to look at is what's the health of the financial system. And it's not just sort of, it's not only the balance sheet, but it's also the requirements of safety and soundness post-Basel III. So you're absolutely right in terms of capital requirements, as well as transparency and accountability, which is now part of the international system. As I said before, 2016 is a very different environment than 15 years ago in terms of what the expectations are for a financial system. And so Iran, I think, has to undertake massive reforms. And what's odd to me is we're bending over backward to demonstrate that it's okay to do business in Iran when they're not even meeting any of those basic standards, be it post-2008 or 2016.
We're bending over backwards. The United States is bending over backwards to tell the international community it's okay to invest there, knowing full well that they are far from compliance with international standards, particularly Basel III. Is that
and we're certainly not sending out roadshows for our allied economies that are struggling with de-risking and other challenges where major banks and businesses are de-risking and getting out because they're not meeting standards. And so I don't see Secretary Kerry talking about investment in Iraq, which maybe we should be, but he's certainly not. And so I think there's a real danger here of mixing messages and altering our own standards by trying to meet the needs of the Iranians as they complain about the restrictions that they're facing in the international system, when the international system is looking clearly at a very risky environment.
I mean, what would be the point of it from your perspective? Why would the United States engage in this?
We certainly want to demonstrate that there's a benefit to the deal, that we can honor our side of the deal, and that's to be commended. And I do take a little bit of issue with those of us who raised questions about the JCPOA. We very much were open, certainly in the Bush administration, to negotiations. And in fact, we started the pressure campaign in 2005 in parallel with a diplomatic process. Deputy Secretary Burns, who was part of the negotiating process for President Obama, was also negotiating on behalf of the Bush administration. So the reality is that we have used these tools as a way of isolating rogue behavior. And the challenge with the JCPOA is that we perhaps have negotiated away our ability to use them aggressively precisely because we've given Iran the voice to say, you're not giving us the benefit of the deal, which was reintegration into the international financial and commercial system. We can't do that if they're not changing their behavior. That's the inherent tension of the deal, and it's precisely what I told the Senate on 2 occasions when these issues were being debated.
Could I just add something very quickly to that? I mean, just to clarify, we never committed to the Iranians in the JCPOA anything to do with outcomes. We never said that we are going to commit to you that you'll be reintegrated in the global financial system. We never said to you that we're going to commit that your GDP is going to increase by 5% and there's going to be $500 billion of foreign direct investment. We committed that we were going to de-designate entities. And we should now be engaged in providing regulatory guidance on what those de-designations mean rather than becoming the business development and trade promotion authority of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
I'm sorry, my time's long expired. I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Congressman Boyle, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. You know, I wanted to associate myself with comments that were made much earlier by my colleague, Representative Brad Sherman. He, I believe, like myself, was someone on the Democratic side of the aisle who found fault with the Iranian nuclear deal and ultimately opposed it. That said, I don't think it's helpful or in any way productive to keep relitigating old ground, and that the point of our work today and in the future for what's in our national security interest, as well as the interest of our allies, is to ensure ways moving forward that we can benefit from the positives of the deal, while at the same time addressing those areas of concern, chief among them for me, and when I wrote an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer in August announcing that I'd be voting against the deal, I talked about how not 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, today, the amount of money, somewhere in the $2 to $4 billion range it's estimated, that Iran is using to fund terrorism, whether it be Hezbollah and the over 100,000 rockets in southern Lebanon that are being pointed at Israel, whether it's Hamas, whether it's their actions to prop up the Assad regime, what they're doing in Yemen, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to kind of, address my comments looking forward prospectively on what can be done today to address sanctions-wise or other tools we have available the bad Iranian behavior and the support for terrorism, while at the same time not doing anything that would violate our own obligations under the JCPOA. So with that comment, let me actually first invite Ms. Rosenberg, who hasn't had an opportunity for a while, to address that.
Thank you for the question. There are a number of things that the United States can do, along with partners and allies in the rest of the world, to address these very serious terrorism concerns, also regional destabilization concerns you've mentioned. Since we're talking about sanctions, first among them is using those authorities aggressively that the United States has. As has been mentioned previously, I fully support the suggestion that Congress could call upon the administration to designate the IRGC in its entirety under terrorism authorities, as well as an aggressive campaign to go after its agents, instrumentalities, front companies, et cetera, in Iran and outside of it as a way to expose this activity and go after it. However, sanctions are certainly not the only tool, possibly not the most important tool for truly combating terrorism activities that Iran sponsors in the region and beyond. Certainly, counterterrorism cooperation with partners in the region or some of Iran's neighbors is an incredibly important activity that occurs already and should be a subject of support from this body and broadly internationally. Intelligence sharing and covert operations activities are also critically important to that set of activities. So that's just a short list.
If anyone wanted to add to that.
Congressman, I think Liz is absolutely right. I think part of this is the position that we need to push back and push back in ways where there's real threats and real risk. One of the suggestions I've made in the past is much more aggressive interdiction of Iranian shipments, which we've seen some of in the context of Yemen.
And we've seen some of that increase recently.
Exactly, because the risk is going to increase precisely because they have more funding, they have more interest, there's more adventurism. That needs to be ramped up with our naval forces as well as allied naval forces. That also raises the specter, which is not included in the negotiations or how we've looked at the risk of the deal, of proliferation with North Korea. The very real possibility that Iran and North Korea continue to collaborate on things like ballistic missile technology has to be a part of what we're looking at in terms of risk and pushing back on. And I also think we shouldn't ignore things like human rights. We have the Magnitsky Act in terms of Russia. Why aren't we thinking more aggressively about what Iran is doing? Certainly, I think one could argue that the human rights abuses in Iran equal, if not surpass, what's happening in Russia. So why isn't there legislation or at least focus there? So I think we've muted our voices a bit because we've wanted the deal, to be honest. But if that's the case, if we have the deal, let's make it work.
Right.
But there are real risks that are still attendant to this. Let's push back on those risks.
Well, I think I'm down to 12 seconds, so let me just kind of conclude with this. When Treasury Secretary Jack Lew sat right there and testified in front of this committee, there was debate on exactly how much money we were unfreezing or making available to them. There were estimates upwards of $150 billion. He said no, that actually the accurate figure is $56 billion. And I took the administration at that. My point was that even if 90% of those funds go toward improving their basket case economy, if they just siphon off 10% to continue terrorist behaviors, that is more money than they have at their entire disposal now for all of their terrorist activities. So making sure that we tackle those funds for behavior that they're doing today is, in my view, the single most important thing Congress can do. I'll yield back.
The gentleman makes a good point. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our hearing is entitled Terrorism, Missiles, and Corruption. I want to touch on the corruption in Iran and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Prohibits United States citizens, United States companies from doing business with people who are bribing officials for business transactions and purposes. Part of the implementation day, the administration issued an edict for the subsidiaries of United States companies to be able to do business with the Iran government. I was just curious if you had any of you had any position or idea of are these subsidiaries actually violating the act? And if they are, how is the parent company protected, the United States parent company from these subsidiaries protected from violating the act itself?
So this is right, that the foreign subs of U.S. parents are allowed under the agreement to be able to do business in Iran. There are a number of caveats which say that they can receive certain back office services from their U.S. parents, but they cannot avail themselves of U.S. persons, financial institutions, the dollar, and other services that many would consider necessary for their functioning. In practice, I think it will be incredibly difficult, if not virtually impossible, for those foreign subsidiaries to do their business, given that as long as they are planning to do so in a responsible manner following existing sanctions and FCPA regulations. And for the parent to protect itself adequately requires, as has been discussed, a tremendous amount of due diligence to ensure that they're not at no part in this company, its subsidiary, involved in inappropriate or illicit activities.
And Congressman, I would just, your question on corruption, I think is an important one, and Juan underscored this, but the pending Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, which is before Congress, is one mechanism which can be used to target corruption, because not only does it target human rights violators, but also government officials and their associates who are responsible for, who are complicit in significant corruption. So Global Magnitsky, I think, again, is not only important for human rights, qua human rights, but also to target corruption. And if you look at Iran's regime, the Supreme Leader himself runs a $95 billion holdco called the Execution of Imam Khomeini's Order, which, by the way, was delisted under the JCPOA. But it is a massive corruption mechanism, as are the bonyads. And so you've got the corruption within the Iranian regime is something, again, not only should we target because it's an effective way to protect the financial system, but also these are the crooks and thieves that are stealing from the Iranian people. And there may be a lot of disagreement in Iran over the nuclear program or other issues, but on the corruption issue, it's certainly clear that for since 1979 and even before that, the Iranian people have been cheated out of their national wealth.
Congressman, I would just say, in terms of the environment in 2016, corruption and the issues of kleptocracy are now on the global agenda, and you clearly see the Department of Justice focusing more and more on aggressive applications of the FCPA. The FIFA case is a great example of the use of anti-corruption prosecutions to actually go after prosecution rings and networks around the world, especially institutions. But three quick issues that I think are important in terms of corruption with respect to Iran. One is the lack of transparency as to who owns what and what is tied to the leadership, everything that Mark and Liz and we've been talking about. The second is the rule of law. What is a contractual relationship in Iran look like? What does it look like, and what are the benefits and facilitation fees, et cetera, tied to dealing with the IRGC or a state-owned company? What is the rule of law in that context? That's a big question. And the third is there's an international standard around how you engage in enhanced due diligence, ask lots of questions about politically exposed persons. It's called PEPs. That's a term of art. Well, Iran is full of PEPs. It's full of high risk of corruption. And so for businesses, one of the reasons they're having trouble with managing how you go in, if you even wanted to go into Iran, is you've got a sea of PEPs that you now have to deal with and engage in enhanced due diligence to understand how they source their funds, what they're doing, what businesses they control. And this is all part of these heightened global standards that Iran is now facing. They're not just facing potential recalcitrance as part of the deal. They're facing heightened international standards that they've never been forced to adhere to.
I thank you all. My time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Ron DeSantis of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dubowitz, I was with this Ben Rhodes article, I was thinking, because I remember during that time when Rouhani was elected and people were starting to say he was a moderate and this was like this great opening. And I never bought that. I think most of our members never bought it. You know, I did think that the administration was just being naive about it. But it turns out, I mean, they never bought it either. I mean, they knew that this was a deal that was really going to be done in conjunction with Iran's hardliners. But it does seem to me, just thinking back, I'm interested in your thoughts, that the deception was very effective. I mean, they did create a narrative in the media that this was a really important opening, that there was a chance for change here, and that that's what they were grabbing onto, even though they had already started down this road before Rouhani was ever elected.
Congressman, that's exactly right. And the reason that that deception was so important is actually because of the technical issues around the nuclear deal. And when I talk in my testimony about a patient pathway to a nuclear weapon, what I mean is that these key restrictions that Congressman Connolly believes are so important are actually going to go away beginning after 5 years, then 8 years, 8.5 years, 10, 15. Now, if Iran ends up in 10, 15 years as a moderate regime with a nuclear weapons capability and an industrial size enrichment program, an ICBM, a powerful economy, regional hegemony, then we're not going to be as concerned, because actually they start to look more like Japan, which has threshold nuclear capability. But if Iran is still ruled by the hard men of Iran, the hardliners, if Rouhani was the supreme leader and he is a hardliner, then we have a very dangerous regime in possession of industrial-sized nuclear capability. That's why that deception that Ben Rhodes has spun out is so damaging.
I agree. In terms of the access to the dollar, I remember the testimony, not just from this committee, but others, about administration says, look, they're not going to have access to the financial system. I believe that they also said it wouldn't even be indirect, but what is your recollection of that? Is what they're trying to do now, does that conflict with any of the testimony that we heard from the administration in the lead up to the deal?
Well, it certainly contradicts the spirit of what they said. I think they were really, really careful to talk about specific access to the U.S. financial system and U-turn transactions. And to Liz's comment, you're right. At some point, a U.S. financial institution is going to have to be involved in offshore dollar clearing, because they're going to have to provide more dollars into the system. If those dollars are have been used, they've got to replace the dollars that have been used. But you can get around that by providing a license to U.S. financial institutions that would legally protect them for providing dollars to the offshore dollar clearing facilities. You can also do it not only through offshore dollar facilities, but through book transfers, intrabank book transfers within the same financial institution that does that conversion and transfer. So I'm concerned the administration has been trying to very carefully thread the needle between its commitments to Congress and its desire to give Iran dollarized financial transactions generally, or in specific classes of transactions.
If I could just respond to that.
Well, hold on, I'm going to have limited time. Mr. Zarate, the Treasury recommends that people considering doing business in Iran or with Iranian persons conduct due diligence to ensure they're not knowingly doing business with the Revolutionary Guard Corps. What are these companies supposed to do? Because there's a huge percentage of the businesses that are controlled by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. You're not going to have a Revolutionary Guard Corps general show up to broker the deals. I mean, these things are sheltered, and there's different things. And so what are companies supposed to do? And can they ever really be sure in some of these instances that they're not providing money for the Revolutionary Guard Corps?
It's incredibly opaque, and you're right. I think any due diligence, be it enhanced or otherwise, is limited by the structure and nature of the environment in which you're doing that diligence. And I doubt that Iran has a corporate registry for all of those companies run by the IRGC. Some of it is public, actually. There's been a lot of research on some of this, but a lot of it is opaque, and we know that they've used shell companies, that we know that they've used procurement agents, we know that they've used classic layering in money laundering fashion to hide their activities. And so it's a very hostile environment to transparency and due diligence. And what you have are financial institutions that are being asked to do that kind of due diligence in other parts of the world in very harsh and difficult environments, now contemplating that in the Iranian context, along with all of the things that Iran does in using or misusing its financial system. That's why it's so risky in doing business, and it's very hard for a CEO or compliance head or a general counsel of a bank to say, I feel fully comfortable that I understand with whom we're doing business, how we're doing it, and to be able to fence ring the kinds of risk that they're exposed to.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's very well stated, and my time is up, but I appreciate everyone's testimony. I yield back.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I'm wondering if we could let Ms. Rosenberg finish her answer.
Without objection. Yes, Mr. Engel.
Thank you. I just wanted to offer that, as the President has stated, the U.S. government is not considering giving Iran access to the U.S. financial system. And in fact, under current restrictions, the U-turn penalty, this is something that banks take very seriously, And when they have abused it, as has been demonstrated in some of the big bank enforcement cases, including by using book-to-book transfers that were inappropriate and constituted evasion, they have been punished severely. So currently, they're not considering it, it's not possible, and it's punishable with severe and expensive financial penalties.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to place into the record this letter from the Treasury Department explaining the administration's policies related to Iranian transactions and access to the U.S. financial system.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, can I say one quick thing? When the President of the United States says very clearly we will not give Iran direct or indirect access to the U.S. dollar, then I think you and your colleagues should be more assured.
Thank you, Mr. Dubowitz. I thank all of our panel today. Mr. Zarate, good to see you again. And we thank you for your time, very insightful testimony. And this was a particularly timely discussion, given Secretary Kerry's meetings in Europe this week and yesterday. And as international financial institutions weigh their reputational risks with a country like Iran, which, as we heard, is not meeting basic international standards. So this hearing stands adjourned. Very good. I thought it was a good hearing.